I'm excited to introduce our next speaker. I normally don't wear a sports coat, but I did for this next speaker. Ron Reagan, as you know, he has some pretty famous parents, right? But he dances to his own drum beat, literally. He left Yale to become a ballet dancer with the Joffrey Ballet Company, then became an actor and a TV and radio personality. He does commentary for MSNBC and both sides now, and is the author of My Father at 100. For many years, Ron Reagan has served as an honorary director of FFRF. FFRF first offered him our Emperor Has No Clothes Award in 2004 for publicly identifying as an atheist when it was brave to do so. Larry King asked if he'd ever run for president, and Ron replied, "I'm an atheist. I can't be elected to anything because polls all say that people won't elect an atheist." Ron addressed the religious opponents of embryonic stem cell research in 2004 at the National Democratic Convention, saying, "It does not follow that the theology of the few should be allowed to forestall the health and well-being of the many." Ron wasn't able to accept the Emperor Has No Clothes Award in person that year, but did so at our Seattle convention in 2009. His last appearance was at an FFRF convention in 2015. But since 2014, you've been seeing a lot of Ron in the TV ad that he so generously recorded for FFRF that year, which was refreshed 2 years ago, and which has become iconic for his improvised remark that he's an unabashed atheist, not afraid of burning in hell. And I've actually stolen that remark and used it quite often. When the ad came out, it was only accepted by Comedy Central's Daily Show and CNN. Even MSNBC's Rachel Maddow's show initially refused it. They gradually relented, though, and eventually so did CBS. Where finances permit, it's run on 60 Minutes, CBS Sunday Morning, and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The ad is still being refused by ABC and NBC. NBC did, however, say that they'd run it, provided that we cut out the ending, which Ron says that he's not afraid of burning in hell. No way. In 2019, when the ad ran during a Democratic primary debate on CNN, many said Ron won the debate. It played most recently over MSNBC's broadcast of the debate between Trump and Biden. Ron's generosity in using his celebrity to promote FFRF has helped make the Freedom from Religion Foundation a household name. Since the ad started appearing in 2014, FFRF's membership has almost doubled. And of course, Ron has a lot to do with that. So on behalf of the FFR board, Ron, we thank you. And we also thank you for being an unabashed atheist, not afraid of burning in hell. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Reagan.
So the Pope and a few of his cardinals are getting together in a swanky hotel room, swanky apartment overlooking St. Peter's Square. It's kind of a wine and crackers sort of soiree. And there's a young priest there who's meant to pour the wine and keep the chip bowls filled. And he's standing by the window and he looks out over the square, and in the distance, coming towards him, sees a strangely familiar figure. long hair, a beard. It's distinctly Middle Eastern looking, wearing what appears to be a loincloth with a tattered robe over his shoulders, and it suddenly hits him what's going on. Your Holiness, Jesus is coming. Yes, that's what we tell people. Now, could you fill up the wine a little, top that off? Okay, so he does that back to the window. Now the guy's a little closer, and he's gathering a crowd. The differently abled are well represented. There are people with skin conditions that may or may not be leprosy, and lots of children are flocking to him, as well as a lion and a lamb who seem to be getting along just fine. Your Holiness, Jesus is coming. Yes, eventually. And when he gets here, I'll be sure to put in a good word for you. Now, the chip bowls are getting a little low. Okay, the chip bowls. Back to the window. Now this guy is like right here. And I mean, come on. He's not even touching the paving stones. He's sort of hovering above them in a golden aura. There's a halo forming over his head. The stigmata are perfectly visible. Mary has shown up. I mean, Your Holiness, please. Jesus is here. What are you going to do? All right, everyone, look busy. I thought I'd ply you with a little bit of humor before plunging us into a spiral of despair. Only to pull up at the end, though. We're gonna do that. But first, before anything, I want to commend the good works that the FFRF is doing. Fine people involved in this organization. It's good and necessary work. And I also want to thank you all for having me here. Dan and Annie Laurie, after a few years, they feel they tolerate me again, so they send me an email and ask me to come. I'm always happy to do it. I love to see where my fellow godless people are up to. Yeah. So, may you live in interesting times, cursed the ancient Chinese, and why not? Interesting times seem like the way to go, right? Who wants to live in boring times? It's like a lifetime of nothing good on TV. Nothing but Punky Brewster reruns or something. But think about it. Interesting, yeah, sure. Ask the dinosaurs how interesting things were 65 million years ago. The fall of Rome, that was interesting. The Black Death in Europe, pretty interesting. Now you're saying, yes, but the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, those were interesting. Yes, they were, but in a sort of drawing room kind of way. Most of the people didn't even know they were happening at the time. Death, disease, destruction, the fires, famines, floods, those are the things that get people's interest. They're really, really interesting. Well, lucky us. Today we live in absolutely fascinating times. An unprecedented set of calamities is unfolding around us like some lotus blossom of the apocalypse. Most of these are of our own making, these problems. Yet, adding to the drama, there's this quirky little feature of human nature that seems to make us do far too little, too late, to address most of these issues. That is, if we do anything at all. Just a few highlights. Global warming, of course. Scientists have been warning about this, by the way, since the late 19th century. 19th century. For years, climate researchers have been warning us that breaching the 1.5 degree Fahrenheit boundary would open the door to an increasingly dire catalog of environmental disasters. Well, according to the most precise satellite measurements, for most of the last year, we have been at or beyond that threshold. 2023 was the hottest year on record until this year. And how's that been working out for us? Phoenix just recorded 110 days in a row above 100 degrees. That's nearly a third of the year. Temps have since dropped into the 90s, which in Phoenix amounts to sweater weather. At least their heads are above water, though, possibly because there is no water. Their aquifers have been turned into putting greens. If we're not burning, it seems we're flooding. Places you've never associated with floods pop up in the news. Connecticut? Really? Cars afloat, people canoeing down Main Street, dogs on rooftops, torrential rain, overflowing rivers, rising sea levels. A number of climate scientists now believe that most of Florida will be underwater by the end of the century. Yes. Some of you may be thinking, so there's an upside. That was terrible. And if there's anybody here from Florida, I ought to be ashamed of myself for even saying that. Really awful, awful there. So the highest point in the state is only 345 feet above sea level. And with the oceans rising as fast as they are, that little knob may soon become the entire state. 75 years we're talking about. That's one human lifetime. And we lose an entire state and Disney World. Think of the economic repercussions. Real estate gone, jobs disappeared, forced migration of millions of people, habitat and species loss. If they're underwater, are they still a state? What happens to the Electoral College? Will we have to modify the flag? Can we just swap Florida for Puerto Rico? These are pressing questions, and the state's governor, Ron DeSantis, has an answer. Stop using the term climate change. If we don't say its name, it can't get in. Sure, we all know about global warming. We're all concerned, unless, of course, we're still denying its existence, like a certain presidential candidate. We try to reduce our personal carbon footprint, but collectively, we pumped more CO2 into the atmosphere last year than at any year in history. We think our next car might be electric, but American automakers have scaled back their plans for EVs because, you know, sales weren't as brisk this year as expected. And you might say, well, okay, so I won't go for the American EV. How about some of those Chinese EVs that are even cheaper? Well, did you notice that the Chinese have been commissioning more coal-fired plants to build and run those EVs? Things are getting worse faster than expected, and we're not doing much about that. Kinda depressing. I guess if it gets too hot, we could decamp to a rapidly melting Antarctica, where it's snowing microplastics. Yes, every breath we take, every drop of rain everywhere on Earth, even the very blood coursing through your veins, is now full of plastic. Plastic, you see, has a special property, besides making packaging that's impossible to open without sustaining injury. When it degrades slowly, ever so slowly, it simply breaks down into ever smaller versions of itself. It remains plastic all the way down to the molecular level, where it can sneak into our bodies and cause who knows what damage. Here's a bonus. As it pollutes our oceans, it contaminates the tiny filter-feeding creatures at the bottom of the marine food chain. You know, the ones that prop up an entire ecosystem upon which billions of people depend for food. Now, you'd think the prospect of kids, their own kids, stuffed with plastic, if not the utter degradation of our environment, just might spur the good folks in the plastics industry to some concerted action aimed at lessening their industry's impact on the planet, or at least on their children's biome. Well, they do have a plan. Produce even more plastic. They hope much more plastic in the coming decades. You think we're swimming in plastic now? Wait till individual grapes come in their own shrink wrap. You think I'm kidding? Just wait. Presumably, the industry will continue blaming us, the consumers, for plastic pollution. Globally, less than 10% of plastic is actually recycled, and according to the plastic people, that's all our fault. I know, depressing, and it gets worse. If only plastic was the sole toxin being pumped into our bloodstreams. Perhaps you've heard of phthalates, or PFAS, or PFCs, as they're sometimes known, ubiquitous chemicals used in packaging, canned food, fire retardants, non-stick coatings, many domestic and industrial uses. It's everywhere and quite toxic, linked to cancers, developmental delay, etc. The EPA has declared that there is no safe dose of PFAS for humans. It's also referred to as a forever chemical. Once in the environment, it will persist for thousands of years, kind of like plastic. As reported on the front page of the New York Times, a lot of PFAS ends up in municipal waste. Waste that is being used year after year as fertilizer on millions and millions of farm acres in America. Now, cows are dying, children are getting sick, farmers are scared for their family's health, that they'll lose their farms. In Maine, the majority of over 100 farms tested had dangerous levels of PFAS. One farm was so toxic, it was taken offline for agriculture forever. That's in forever. PFAS has turned up on farmland in Michigan as well. Naturally, you'd expect the state of Michigan to quickly begin testing its farms to assess the extent of the crisis. They have not. They're concerned, as well they might be, that what they'll find will devastate their agricultural industry, an industry increasingly dependent on a toxic fertilizer that is poisoning the life out of their farms, their livestock, their families. Imagine this playing out globally. You don't have to. It is. Pretty depressing. Yeah, better to just look away. Are you beginning to sense a theme here? Big, scary problem is identified. A serious response is required, but said response would gore many oxen and upset apple carts large and small. Besides, big, scary problems are so big and scary. Better we ignore the problem altogether. Pretend it doesn't exist, minimize it. Maybe acknowledge it, but only as a concern for future generations. Or as a last resort, you can accuse the people raising concerns about the problem of being lunatics with malign, probably communist intent. It's human nature. When threats of monumental proportions arise, especially ones for which we bear responsibility, we stick our anxious heads in a bucket of sand. Thing is, that strategy doesn't make the problems go away. They just fester. The list is long. Homelessness in our cities, income inequality, social media algorithms that divide us while preying on our kids, food that isn't food, making us sick, infertility rates spiking, birth rates tanking, leading to the coming population crash, which admittedly would be a benefit for every other living thing on the planet. And that old favorite, backed by popular demand, courtesy of guys like Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, nuclear holocaust. Yes, indeed, duck and cover. Truly depressing, indeed. But don't worry, Elon Musk is going to move us all to Mars, where there's nothing but volcanic dust to eat, and the temperature is a balmy minus 80 degrees. Truly depressing, but very, very interesting. All right, now here's where we pull the plane out of its nosedive a little bit here. There is another threat, just as insidious, perhaps more immediate, that speaks directly to the work of the FFRF. The battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Around the world, and crucially, right here in America, authoritarianism, with its usual bedfellows, is gaining ground. The good news is, here in America, we have something to say about that. We still live in a democratic republic for now, but that could change faster than you think. As he left the Continental Congress, having helped draft our Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, as you probably know, was asked, "Do we have a monarchy or a republic?" "A republic," he replied, "if you can keep it." Democracy is both new and terribly difficult to maintain. It is fragile and needs constant tending. We think of ourselves as the oldest democracy on earth, but for roughly half our history, women weren't allowed to vote, never mind the slaves. You can, in fact, make a strong argument that we were not truly a democracy until the civil rights legislation of the mid-60s, particularly the Voting Rights Act. Pretty newfangled, this democracy thing. Work in progress. We're still figuring it out. And some folks still don't cotton to the idea of every citizen having the right to vote. The next months will tell us whether our experiment in representative government that began nearly 240 years ago will continue, whether ideas like liberty and justice for all will spread around the globe or wither and vanish like Lindsey Graham's spine or Lauren Boebert's cerebral cortex. Democracy is a conversation, sometimes an unruly argument. It's messy. It requires compromise. You have to accept losing. Yes. Much of this does not come naturally to barely evolved apes, including a certain unevolved presidential candidate. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, is easy. It may be the human default setting. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that an urge for self-determination is universal, that a yearning for freedom and liberty is baked into everyone's genes. There are many people in the world who long for the dubious comforts of tyranny, who are waiting for the strong man to arrive. He might ride in on a tall horse. He may have a funny mustache, or slather his face with pumpkin-hued pancake and sport a Baroque comb-over. Doesn't matter. There will always be gullible victims who clamor for his grift. This is where religion, perhaps the original grift, joins the picture. How many current autocrats have linked themselves to a church, have exploited religious fervor for their own ends? Vladimir Putin doesn't strike me as a particularly pious fellow, more a poison my political foes, invade neighboring countries, threaten nuclear war kind of guy. Yet he's very chummy with the Russian Orthodox Church, promoting himself as a defender of the faith. And they, in turn, not wanting to be poisoned or nuked and always drawn to power, have bear-hugged him back. Know who else hearts Putin? The evangelical right here in the United States. They see him as a warrior for Christendom. Many say they'd rather he was our president than any stinky, squishy, godless Democrat. Narendra Modi of India has been fanning the flames of Hindu-Muslim animosity, a pool of gasoline that barely needs a match. Like many authoritarians, past and present, he has discovered that demonizing a vulnerable minority, in this case Muslim citizens, boosts your chances of re-election. He's also an example of autocrats forming mutual fan clubs. When Putin invaded the Ukraine and the West responded with sanctions, Modi was eager to lend a hand to Putin. In Afghanistan, the ruling Taliban have married governance with the worst impulses of religious zealotry. Afghan women already deprived of the right to an education, jobs, or the simple liberty to leave home without a male chaperone, even while wearing those beekeeper suits. Well, they've got more problems here now because things in Afghanistan weren't tragic enough already. Women are officially barred from speaking in public. Not public speaking, just speaking. The Afghan men, as usual, have nothing interesting to say. What is it with so many religionists that makes them so terrified of women, that makes them want to deprive women of basic rights, makes them want to do terrible things to women? When the Gazans stormed across the Israeli border on October 7th, opening the latest act in their long-running territorial religious conflict, they had been told to do as they pleased to the people in the kibbutzim. Apparently, what pleased many of them was to hunt down young girls, gleefully raping, torturing, mutilating, and murdering those they didn't drag back to the howling mobs in Gaza as hostages or trophies. Was that a political statement? Religious fervor? Or a particularly perverse, shamelessly sadistic fusion of the two? And let's not let Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu off the hook. He only clings to power through the good graces of the right-wing religious fanatics in his governing coalition. They embrace violence every bit as much as Hamas. They, too, viewing the battle through their own religious lens, see a zero-sum conflict with no point in compromise. Authoritarian rule, whether secular or religious, shares certain features. It's almost invariably bigoted, racist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, homophobic. It rules by fear, seeks out vulnerable groups to victimize, gay people, trans kids, folks of other religions, folks with no religion, of course, and immigrants, the poor. It moves quickly to demonize, stifle, and finally shutter a free press. It subverts independent courts. Elections become shams, with leaders ultimately being elected for life. Think Viktor Orban in Hungary. Dictators aren't up for a discussion, which pretty much precludes any real stab at democracy. If they're not claiming to speak to God and for God, they're claiming to be God, like the Kim family in North Korea. Kiss their asses or go straight to a fiery hell. We're not quite ready for the burqa here in America, not quite living in a handmaid's tale, but don't kid yourself, there are plans afoot, and not just Project 2025, aiming to create an avowedly Christian nation under the thumb of ideologically vetted white males. Let's call them MAGA Christians. The folks plotting to take over would purge the government of non-believers in God, in Trump. They'd stack the judiciary and Justice Department with cronies, reward sycophants, and use the power of the state to punish their opponents. And don't forget, girls, they'll want to monitor your menstrual cycles and gynecological visits, the better to punish you for even considering an abortion. If you get pregnant, they'll force you to stay pregnant. It's their call, not yours. Not that they really care about fetuses, they just want to punish you for having sex. One look at Samuel Alito's pinched, angry face tells you it's all about the sex. The usual caveat: there are plenty of believers who cherish freedom, even for non-believers like us, who value the separation of governance and theology just as we do, who carry their faith into the public square quietly and with dignity, who don't try to impose their beliefs on those who don't share them. But here in the US and elsewhere, their sane voices are increasingly being drowned out by a braying mob of religious extremists bent on bully power. And too few people in public life and the media seem willing to stand up to them. Worse, here at home, the candidate for president from one of our two major parties has linked up with Christian nationalists. A once proud party, at least marginally sane, is now enthralled to a grifting sociopath perfectly willing to cater to religious zealots despite his own utter lack of faith. I mean, is there anything funnier than watching Donald Trump, as Charles mentioned, dodge the question, what's your favorite Bible passage? I mean, sure, he can hawk Bibles online, he just hasn't read one. But he's certainly relentless. Got a lot of energy, old Don. As that prophetic poet of the apocalypse, William Butler Yeats, put it, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Well, the best of us had better absorb some of that intensity. There is a lot on the line this year. We don't usually wake up in the morning thinking we have to save democracy, or our nation, or the world, for that matter. But here we are. History has tracked us down. Like it or not, this is our moment. And since it's quite likely the only one we'll get, we'd better make the most of it. The past is gone. The future is a toss-up. And here we sit, right now, flipping the coin. The present moment, the only moment we will ever know, our moment to make a difference, our moment to matter. We can cut our emissions of CO2 and lessen the consequences of climate change, but the carbon we've already pumped into the atmosphere will be heating the planet for centuries. Microplastics, maybe we can come up with something that eats the stuff. Most likely, archaeologists a million years from now will identify our era by its layer of plastic. PFAS, here to stay, whether we want to think about it or not. But authoritarianism, particularly the homegrown variety, that's another matter. We can do something about that. It doesn't take a degree in physics or chemistry or engineering. We just have to look the issue squarely in the eye. Don't fall for the false equivalencies. Don't buy the both sidesism and whataboutism. When somebody gets indignant about Kamala Harris not doing enough press interviews, point out that the other guy tried to overthrow the government. Maybe we shouldn't give him another chance. So, pretty simple. Get out and vote. Tell your friends and coworkers to vote. Have them tell their friends and coworkers to vote. Tell your crazy uncle with the Let's Go Brandon t-shirt the election already happened and he missed it. Sorry, Uncle Bob. Vote like the nation depends on your vote, because it does. Vote like your life depends on it, because it does. Vote for your children. Vote for your grandchildren, not to reclaim a mythic past, but for right here, right now, and for all the present moments yet to come. Thank you so much. Too kind. Are we doing cues? Are we doing questions?
Aloha from Hawaii.
Oh, aloha.
I love, absolutely adore every time I see your commercial.
Oh, well, thanks. Appreciate it.
You keep me sane. You really do. And so does FFRF. But, you know, we have to come out of the closet to remind people that we do have freedom of religion and from religion.
And from religion, yes, from religion.
But thank you for everything you've done. I so admire you. My gay son admires you. My daughter admires you.
Well,
even my husband admires you.
Well, if I ever need a fan club, I'll know where to go.
Oh, my question is, how do we know when we've done enough? Like, I'm 78. I can't do sign waving anymore.
Right.
I can't do door to door, but I become a billboard.
Well,
that Hawaii
we'll know,
doesn't.
I suppose, in the near term, we'll
Pardon
know
me?
that we've done enough when the orange turd bucket doesn't make it to the White House. Then we'll know that we've done something there, and we're on the way, at least. It won't be the end of the story, as Charles mentioned. That's not the end, but it'll be a start. Maybe it's the beginning of the end.
We appreciate your enthusiasm to hopefully change the outcome so that the next election will be favorable to life on Earth. And so anyway, there's been discussion about immigration with the climate change, and there's been some discussion that by scientists that if the climate keeps warming up within a few decades, it might be so hot in the United States like that during the day people won't be able to go outside without air conditioning, like they have to stay inside their house all day because it'll be so hot it will be totally unbearable. And I know we've got our fingers crossed about the next election, but can people like kind of emphasize more about the climate, about how you know it could be disastrous where we just can't if people immigrate, they go to another place and it's unbearable there, and they go to another place it's unbearable, and Florida's underwater. I mean,
everybody just keeps moving north until everybody's living at the North Pole. Which won't work, by the way.
How can people like raise the alarm so the general population understands the gravity of the situation?
Well, there's nothing like a few hurricanes and heat waves and all that to wake people up. You're quite correct that there are going to be places on Earth, and even here in the United States, Phoenix would be at the top of the list, I think, where they simply will be uninhabitable, at least during certain times of the year. You may have heard of something called a wet bulb temperature. It's a combination of temperature and humidity. It's basically the feels-like temperature. So one of the hottest places on Earth is actually in the Gulf, at the head of the Gulf there, Arabia and Iraq and all. And there was a wet bulb temperature there, I think it was a year or two ago, 150 degrees. That's 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, at that point, you're cooking. Literally, your body is cooking. People can't live in temperatures like that. And you're going to see mass migrations due to temperature, lack of water, which is already happening in many places. Mexico City, for instance, has very little water left now. But yes, water and food. Crops are going to dry up, drought and all that. And you're going to see massive migrations. You think it's bad now? Yeah, no, you haven't seen nothing yet.
Thank you. A wonderful speech. And since you started this off with a joke about the Pope, this is not the Pope, but this is a yard sign that I've seen here, and maybe you've seen it too, but it's sometimes you have to flush twice.
Or maybe 10 or 12 times, with the toilets now. You can't,
Hi, I heard you talking about how a lot of people still don't support voting rights, and I think that it took a large social movement to free the slaves, to give African Americans and women the right to vote, and Congress has stated that a sixth grade education is sufficient for any U.S. citizen to vote, and that makes me wonder, well, when do the youth get our turn? When is our social movement?
I didn't catch the last part of that, but I get that you're talking about voting rights and people being allowed to vote. And yes, there are many people in this country who don't want a lot of people voting because they're not going to vote for their side. It's just as simple as that. Republicans don't want a lot of people voting because the more people that vote, generally, the less well they do. So they're going to work as hard as they can to keep people from voting. But really, why do we have this kind of Byzantine system of registration and all this? How about if you're born in the United States, along with your birth certificate, you get a little certificate that says, and when this person turns 18, they're registered to vote. How about when you get a driver's license, you register to vote? I mean, this shouldn't be complicated. Every American citizen should just automatically have the right to vote. I know you talk about felons maybe, but I don't even agree
like
with
who
felons
decided
not
on
voting.
18?
Pardon?
Who decided on 18? Where did that come from?
Who decided on 18?
Yeah,
well, it used
where'd
to be
that-
21, and then we lowered it to 18.
When
Some
are we
people would
gonna
like to
lower it
lower it
again?
to 16. The older I get, the less good that sounds. I have to admit, I know some 16-year-olds, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I think I need to move over here.
Charles Blow inspired me with one item of hope, and that is in the Senate. But I come from a place, some people call it a state, Massachusetts, but we really are more like a bubble. I don't think I need to worry and need to call Elizabeth Warren or to work for her to get reelected. She's pretty strong. So I was asking, what can I do? What can I do as somebody from Massachusetts? And I found something I can do, and I just wanted to pass it on to everyone here. There are the swing states. And right now, every week, I go online to Turn Pennsylvania Blue, and they have a big phone bank where you can make calls to registered voters who are leaning liberal and urge them to vote and offer them support if they need to register or get a mail-in ballot. So that is something we can all do, even if we live in a bubble like Massachusetts.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Bravo. Have I worn you all out yet?
Obviously, people are the problem. How come I don't hear anything about population control?
Well, the population is about to be controlled in a big way if the demographers are correct. You do understand what's happening with the peak, and particularly in places like China, for instance, or Italy, where I spend a lot of time. My wife is Italian. The birth rates there are tanking. This is math, which I'm not very good at, but once you go below 2.1 births per woman, per couple, things start going off a cliff.
Well,
And they're about to, apparently. So that's going to be population control.
Okay, so first off, when I was a little kid,
Yeah.
I remember watching your father. He was the first president in my memory. I had zero interest in anything that came out of his mouth. But I remember watching him as the representative of our country. And, you know, somebody that when my parents, who happen to be a lot older than me, I'm the last of 6 Catholic kids, and there's a big age gap. So I was taught how I thought a lot of the morals and respect for other people and like ethics outside of politics, republicanism, any of that. I looked at your father as kind of a pillar of the way to act and to treat people. I was taught morals and respect that way. I am now estranged from my own father and have been for some time, partly because of my atheism, and partly now because of politics and his support for the orange one that shall not be named. And like I said, outside of politics, policy, tribalism, and all that, how do you feel as his son that people say, well, I support Trump because I've supported Republicans starting with Reagan, like my father does. My father justifies supporting Trump, talking about Reagan, and I kind of feel like that is it's a moral and an ethics issue for me. How do they take somebody who at least appeared to be very moral and ethical, at least on you know, from a humanistic standpoint, to somebody like Donald Trump? Where is that, and how does that affect you, seeing the support for this person and part of them justifying it starting
I'll
from
admit
that?
it's annoying.
Yeah.
You know, it's, you know, now there's a fellow named Max Boot who's just come out with a biography of my father, very good. He's a friend of mine too. And he makes the point that there are aspects to my father's political career that seem to be setting the stage in a way for Trumpism, but that's not just about my father, that's about the Republican Party. You know, my father didn't start the Southern strategy. That started under Nixon, which was basically the civil rights era comes along, and a lot of white Southerners in particular are just having none of this Voting Rights Act and all this kind of stuff. And so Nixon saw an opportunity there to cultivate white racism to his advantage. And he did that. Now, it's true that my father would occasionally engage in what you could say were racist dog whistles. I'm not sure, knowing him personally, and this may sound weird and you may think I'm just making excuses for him, but if you knew him, this would make some sense. I'm not sure he actually realized that's what he was doing. And certainly if somebody had said to him, we need you to go give the racist dog whistle, he'd have, you know, been appalled that that's, you know, what he was supposed to be doing. Just in terms of personal character, though, are you getting ready to put me out? Okay. In terms of personal character, I can't think of anybody more diametrically opposed to Trump than my father. Whatever you think about his politics, and I certainly didn't agree with you know, a lot of it, he was a very decent human being. And he did care about people, and he really cared about his country, you know, more than himself. one little story just to illustrate this. At a certain point, Ron Reagan, who you might remember was the Treasury Secretary, was becoming a bit of a problem and was not helping the administration. And a lot of people around my father were telling him, you got to fire Ron Reagan. Mike Deaver came in, who was a close advisor of his, and tried to make this case. And according to Deaver, I think my father picked up some keys that were on his table and threw them at Deaver's chest. And Deaver said, damn near knocked him over. And he said, I'm damned if I'm going to fire somebody just to save my ass. Now, can you imagine Donald Trump saying something like that? I'll be damned to throw somebody else under the bus just to save my big, behind. Yeah, not going to happen. Not going to happen. So anyway, thank you so much. Appreciate it very much. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Wonderful. Wonderful show.